Picture this. It is October 23rd, 1969. The ballroom of a New York hotel is silent. Not because the room is empty, it is packed. Photographers line every wall. Socialites in evening gowns press forward on their heels. A security team of 8 men forms a circle. And at the center of it all, around the neck of one of the most photographed women on earth, sits a stone, 69.42 carats, the size of a small egg, the most famous diamond in the world. And the woman wearing it is Elizabeth Taylor. Violet eyes, dark hair, that face, the one that stopped traffic in London at age 7, stopped Hollywood in its tracks at age 9, and stopped the entire planet cold for 6 decades. She is 37 years old. She looks like a queen. But if you look closely, if you really look, you will see something else. You will see a woman who has buried 3 husbands emotionally, buried 1 husband physically, survived a tracheotomy that should have killed her, checked herself into a psychiatric ward twice, fought a studio system that wanted to own her body, and loved a man so violently, so completely, so recklessly, that the whole world watched and didn't know whether to call it the greatest love story of the 20th century or the most spectacular slow-motion catastrophe they had ever seen. The diamond weighs 69 carats. Elizabeth Taylor's life weighed far more. You know the name. You know the violet eyes. You know the 8 marriages. You know the tabloid headlines that followed her like a second shadow. But you don't know Liz, not the real one. Not the girl born into a world that decided she was a treasure before she was old enough to understand what that meant. Not the child MGM turned into a product. Not the woman who lost so much so many times that grief became the one constant in a life otherwise defined by inconstancy. Diamonds, they say, are formed under pressure. Enormous, crushing, relentless pressure. And if you want to understand Elizabeth Taylor, really understand her, you have to understand the pressure first. This is her story, the real one. She was born on February 27th, 1932, in a red brick house in Hampstead, London. She was not supposed to become a star. She was supposed to become a proper English lady. Her father, Francis Len Taylor, was a well-bred American art dealer who had settled in London and opened a gallery on Bond Street. Her mother, Sarah Viola Warmbrot, had been a stage actress before marriage, performing under the name Sarah Southern, but she had given that up, as women of her generation were expected to do. They had a son, Howard, 3 years older than Elizabeth. They had a respectable life, a tasteful house, dinner parties where the conversation stayed civilized. And then Elizabeth was born, and everything shifted. She had, from the moment she arrived, an extraordinary face. People commented on it the way they might comment on a piece of art in her father's gallery, with a kind of reverent bewilderment. The eyes, especially, violet, not blue, not grey-blue. Violet, a genetic quirk so rare that most people assumed the photographs were tinted. They weren't. Elizabeth was 18 months old when she performed her first dance for an audience, a birthday party. Friends of her parents, who fell silent watching this child move. Sarah Taylor noted it. She noted everything. By the time Elizabeth was 3, Sarah was enrolling her in dance lessons. By 5, she was performing in recitals. By 7, she was attracting attention on the streets of London, strangers stopping to stare, to comment, to reach out and touch her hair. Her mother learned to place herself between the strangers and her daughter. It would become a habit that lasted years. Sarah always between Elizabeth and the world, not quite protecting her, not quite protecting herself. It is hard to know where the mother ended and the ambition began. Then came the war. In September 1939, with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, the world Elizabeth knew collapsed overnight. Her father's gallery, filled with valuable paintings, many of them owned by European Jewish families desperate to liquidate their assets, became suddenly precarious. England was under threat. London would soon be under bombs. Francis and Sarah made the decision quickly. They would go to America. Elizabeth was 7 years old when she boarded the ship. She left behind her grandparents, her cousins, her school friends, her whole first world. She arrived in New York and then Los Angeles with a British accent, a British reserve, and a face that America did not yet know what to do with. Hollywood figured it out within 2 years. A family friend, a producer named Andrea Behrens, introduced Sarah Taylor to executives at Universal Pictures. Elizabeth was brought in for a screen test at the age of 9. The camera moved over her face the way a jeweler moves a loop over a stone. They signed her, but Universal let her go within months. She was, they said, too British. The accent was a problem. Sarah Taylor was not deterred. She moved to MGM. MGM did not let her go. MGM signed Elizabeth Taylor in 1941. She was 9 years old. Her contract paid her mother $100 a week, not Elizabeth, her mother. Elizabeth was the asset, Sarah was the handler, and Louis B. Mayer, the emperor of MGM, the man who had built the most powerful studio in Hollywood history, understood exactly what he had acquired. Not a child, a diamond. In the rough, yes, but a diamond. And MGM, as it did with all its diamonds, would spend the next decade polishing her, shaping her, making sure she reflected the light exactly as they wanted. No one asked Elizabeth how she wanted to reflect the light. No one thought to ask. In 1943, Elizabeth Taylor was 11 years old. She was also, already, a veteran. She had filmed There's One Born Every Minute for Universal. She had filmed Lassie Come Home for MGM. A small role, a few scenes, but enough that the camera had found her again and refused to look away. She had been on studio property more days than she had been in a schoolroom. She had eaten lunch in the MGM commissary surrounded by adults in costume. She had learned to perform on command, to hit marks on a floor, to cry real tears on cue. She was 11, and then she read the script for National Velvet. The story of Velvet Brown, a young English girl who disguises herself as a boy to ride her horse, the Pie, in the Grand National Steeplechase, had been a beloved novel since 1935. MGM had been trying to adapt it for years. The girl who could play Velvet had to be a believable 12-year-old, had to be British enough to carry the accent, and had to have a quality that went beyond mere prettiness. She had to have soul. Elizabeth Taylor had all three. She campaigned for the role with a ferocity that surprised the adults around her. She begged the producer, Pandros Berman. She begged her mother. She told them she would grow 3 inches before filming began. And then, almost impossibly, she did. She grew 3 inches in 4 months, as though her body understood what was at stake. National Velvet began filming in 1943 and was released in December 1944. It made Elizabeth Taylor a star, not a child actress. A star. At 12 years old, she was on the cover of Life magazine. Fan mail arrived at MGM in sacks. The studio's publicity department went into high gear. They crafted a backstory, a persona, a carefully managed image. Elizabeth Taylor, the English rose transplanted to American soil, wholesome and magical and untouchable. She was 12. She was also learning, though she could not have articulated it yet, that stardom is a performance that never ends, that the audience is always watching, that the girl and the star are 2 different people, and the studio only cared about one of them. After National Velvet, MGM enrolled Elizabeth in its on-lot school, where she received 3 hours of education a day, the legal minimum for child actors in California. The rest of her waking hours belonged to MGM, fittings, publicity shoots, rehearsals, filming. She had tutors, but she did not have a childhood. She had co-stars, but she did not have friends her own age. She had a mother who accompanied her everywhere, who spoke for her in meetings, who managed her schedule and her diet and her hair. Elizabeth was not allowed to be ordinary. Ordinary had been sacrificed on the altar of extraordinary. She later said in interviews, and there would be many interviews, across many decades, that National Velvet was both the best and the most dangerous thing that ever happened to her. The best because it showed her the power of her own talent. The dangerous because it convinced everyone around her, the studio, her mother, the public, that Elizabeth Taylor the star was more valuable than Elizabeth Taylor the person. The studio's records from this period are clinical. They record her weight every week, her measurements, her hair color, her skin condition. She is described in memos not as a child, but as a property. The Taylor girl, asset, contract term, renewal pending, a diamond, catalogued and appraised. The question of what she felt, what she wanted, does not appear in the records. It rarely did. By the time Elizabeth Taylor was 15, she had appeared in 6 films. She had not gone to a regular school. She had not attended a prom. She had not walked down a street anonymously since before the war. She did not know how to grocery shop, how to navigate public transport, how to have a conversation with someone who did not want something from her. What she did know, with extraordinary precision, was how to be Elizabeth Taylor, the public one, the one the studio had built. MGM in the late 1940s was both the most glamorous place on earth and a very particular kind of prison. Louis B. Mayer ruled it like a feudal lord. He had a nickname for Elizabeth, my little girl, that made her skin crawl. He controlled what his stars wore, who they dated, what they said in interviews, and what they weighed. Elizabeth's weight was weighed weekly. When it crept above the studio's desired number, she was put on a diet of black coffee, cigarettes, and amphetamines, a standard practice for MGM's female stars. She was 15. The amphetamines kept her thin, the coffee kept her awake on set, and the cigarettes, well, the cigarettes were something the studio gave out freely, the way offices today give out coffee. It was the 1940s. No one thought twice. What they planted in her body at 15 would grow into something far larger. She filmed Life with Father 1947, A Date with Judy 1948, Little Women 1949. She grew more beautiful with every role, not the soft prettiness of her childhood, but something sharper, more dangerous. The violet eyes deepened, the cheekbones emerged. The figure that MGM had watched so carefully began to bloom into exactly the kind of figure that made Hollywood's cameras go quiet, with something that was not entirely professional. She was 17 when she filmed Conspirator 1949 opposite Robert Taylor, a 40-year-old man. The studio promoted the pairing without apparent discomfort. It was, to them, simply commerce. Her father Francis watched the machinery closing around his daughter and grew increasingly uneasy. He was an art dealer. He understood the relationship between beauty and exploitation. He began drinking heavily. He would spend the rest of his life at an uncomfortable distance from Hollywood, unable to stop what was happening to Elizabeth, unable to look away. Her mother Sarah, by contrast, leaned in. Sarah had given up her own acting career when she married. She had come to America. She had made the calculations that women of her generation made. And now, through Elizabeth, something extraordinary was possible. Not for Elizabeth, for the family, for the name, for the security that Sarah had always wanted and never quite had. Sarah Taylor was not a villain. She was a product of her time, a woman who understood that her daughter's beauty was a resource with a limited shelf life, and that resource had to be deployed wisely, quickly, and without sentiment. Elizabeth understood none of this consciously. She understood it the way children understand things, in her body, in her silences, in the flinching that happened when someone reached for her face without warning. She was 17 when Father of the Bride, 1950, was released. She played Kay Banks, a young woman preparing for her wedding, radiant with anticipation, navigating her father's gentle grief over losing his little girl. The role required her to be innocent, glowing, untouched by the world. She played it perfectly. The performance was a lie. But Elizabeth Taylor had been lying, performing, since the age of 9. By 17, she could do it in her sleep. The studio was happy. Elizabeth was tired. And behind the scenes, Sarah Taylor was already accepting dinner invitations from the son of one of the wealthiest hotel families in America. His name was Nicky Hilton. He would be Elizabeth's first disaster. She was 18 years old on the day she got married. May 6, 1950. The Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. 800 guests. A white gown designed by MGM's Helen Rose, with a 15-foot train. Cameras everywhere, because MGM had negotiated the exclusive rights to the wedding photographs. Even her wedding was a publicity event. The groom was Conrad Nicholson Hilton Jr., Rettenroom Nicky to his friends. He was 23, the son of Conrad Hilton Sr., the founder of the Hilton Hotel empire. He was handsome, rich, charming in the way that men raised with unlimited money can be charming, effortlessly, carelessly, until the effort runs out. The romance had been brief and studio managed. MGM approved it. Sarah approved it. The publicity department saw gold. Elizabeth, who had been in love with the idea of love since she was a child, watching her parents pretend that everything was fine. Elizabeth said yes. The honeymoon began on the Queen Mary, sailing to England. What happened on that honeymoon? Elizabeth would not discuss publicly for many years. What is documented is this. She lost weight rapidly. She appeared at events with dark circles under her eyes that her makeup could not entirely cover. She arrived back in America quieter than she had left. In private, she told friends that Nicky Hilton was a different man behind closed doors. A gambling addict. A drinker. A man who became, in her word, violent. She would later say that she spent her wedding night alone while he gambled, and that the weeks that followed were the most frightening of her life. She was 18. She had no money of her own. MGM controlled her earnings. She had no independent life. She had been raised to be a wife and a star, and she had achieved both, and both felt like traps. She lasted 8 months. On January 29, 1951, Elizabeth Taylor filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. She was not yet 19. The studio managed the narrative with surgical precision. Elizabeth was positioned as the innocent party. Too young, too pure, too trusting. The public largely agreed. Sympathy flowed. Box office numbers held. But something had shifted. Elizabeth Taylor had walked into that marriage believing in love stories the way an MGM heroine would, without question, without contingency. She came out the other side, understanding that men were not what they appeared to be in the lobby of your mother's approval. And the studio, watching her, understood something too. Scandal, carefully managed, made her more interesting, more human, more watchable. She filmed A Place in the Sun in 1951, opposite Montgomery Clift. It is one of the finest performances of her career. A wealthy young woman who falls for a man of lower social standing, a love that is real but that cannot survive the world it exists in. Montgomery Clift was one of the few people in Elizabeth's life who saw her as she was, not as the studio had made her. They became close friends. The friendship would last until his death in 1966, and it was, she said, one of the most important relationships of her life. But A Place in the Sun is also a film about illusion, about the distance between what we want love to be and what it actually is. If you watch Elizabeth Taylor in that film, and you should, you will notice something that the critics of 1951 noticed too. She is not performing. She is not hitting marks. She is doing something rarer and more dangerous. She is being honest. The camera noticed. Director George Stevens noticed. America noticed. She was 19. She had already survived one marriage, one studio system, one childhood stripped of its ordinary pleasures. She had already learned that beauty is not protection. The next marriage would teach her something else. It would teach her that kindness, too, can be a kind of slow suffocation. Michael Wilding was everything Nicky Hilton was not. He was 40 when he married Elizabeth on February 21st, 1952. She was 20. He was British, a film actor of the old school, charming, gentle, self-deprecating in the way that English men of his generation were trained to be. He made her laugh. He did not frighten her. He was, in the vocabulary of women who have been hurt once and are not sure they can survive being hurt again, safe. She wanted safe. They had 2 sons, Michael Howard Wilding Jr., Gene, born January 6, 1953, and Christopher Edward Wilding, born February 27, 1955, on Elizabeth's 23rd birthday. The double gift of a child's birth and her own birthday on the same day. She loved her sons with a fierceness that surprised people who only knew her as a screen goddess. Motherhood was not a performance. It was the one role she had not been cast in, had not been managed or photographed into, had simply stepped into from the inside out. She breastfed in an era when it was considered not quite glamorous. She insisted on being present for bedtimes when the studio wanted her on set. MGM was not pleased. A star who was also a mother was complicated. A mother's body changed. A mother's priorities shifted. A mother could not always be available at 6 a.m. for a lighting test. The marriage, meanwhile, was gently, quietly collapsing. On May 12, 1959, Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher married in Las Vegas. It was her 4th marriage. She was 27. The studios, which had been wringing their hands, quickly recalculated. Controversy, they had learned, sold tickets. Moral outrage drove people to theaters the way nothing else quite did. Everyone wanted to see the woman they were supposed to hate. She filmed suddenly, last summer, 1959, she filmed Butterfield 8, 1960, a film she publicly hated, calling it a piece of junk, filming it only because MGM contractually required it. She played a woman of easy virtue, beautiful and damaged, using her body as a tool against the world. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated her for Best Actress. She did not expect to win. She had been nominated before, for Raintree County 1957, and had not won. Butterfield 8 was not, she felt, her finest work. And then, in March of 1961, something happened that changed everything. While pre-producing the epic film Cleopatra in London, Elizabeth Taylor collapsed. Not metaphorically, not for the cameras. She stopped breathing. It began as bronchitis. That was the diagnosis in February 1961, when Elizabeth reported feeling unwell on the set of Cleopatra at Pinewood Studios in London. The British winter was brutal that year. Wet, grey, bone-deep cold. She had been working under pressure for months. The production was already in chaos. $7 million spent, not a single frame of usable film. Director Ruben Mamoulian fired, the entire production about to be scrapped. The bronchitis became pneumonia. The pneumonia became something worse. On March 4, 1961, Elizabeth Taylor stopped breathing. Completely. In her suite at the Dorchester Hotel in London, her lungs filled with fluid, her oxygen levels plummeted, and she lost consciousness. The doctors had 4 minutes. They performed an emergency tracheotomy, a procedure that involves cutting directly into the throat to create an airway. It is not a delicate operation. It is a last resort. It is what you do when everything else has failed, and the alternative is death. It left a scar on her throat that she would carry for the rest of her life. A thin white line just below the jawline. In later years, when she wore jewels, and she always wore jewels, they rested just above that scar. She survived. She nearly didn't. When she appeared at the Academy Awards ceremony 3 weeks later to accept the Oscar for Best Actress for Butterfield 8, the entire audience rose before her name was announced. Not for the performance, for the survival. The bandage was still visible at her throat. The standing ovation lasted 90 seconds. She stood at the podium and said simply, "I don't really know how to express my gratitude for your generosity. I guess I just thank you with all my heart." She was 29. She had been to the edge of death and back. And she was about to fly to Rome to film Cleopatra. The production that reassembled in Rome in the autumn of 1961 was unlike anything cinema had ever seen. 20,000 extras, hundreds of costumes, sets that took months to construct, a budget that would eventually reach $44 million, making Cleopatra the most expensive film ever made at that point in history. And, on a marble set on the outskirts of Rome, Elizabeth Taylor met Richard Burton. He was 36, she was 29. He was Welsh, from a mining town, the 13th of 13 children, a man who had climbed from poverty to the pinnacle of the English-speaking theatre with nothing but his voice, his intelligence, and a ferocious, hungry ambition. He was also married, so was she. What happened between them on that set has been described in thousands of books, articles, and documentary films. It was, by all accounts, immediate, electric, visible from the other side of the soundstage. The director, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, later said he could feel it in the room when they filmed their first scenes together, a kind of chemical reaction, like two unstable elements finally meeting. Burton called her in his diary, "the most beautiful creature I have ever seen in my life." Elizabeth called him something less poetic and more honest. "Richard was the first man I couldn't control." The affair became public in February 1962. The Vatican, the actual Vatican, issued a formal condemnation. The Italian government threatened to expel them from the country. Headlines around the world screamed "La Scandale." Eddie Fisher, still technically Elizabeth's husband, flew to Rome. He found what he found. He left. And Elizabeth Taylor, who had survived a near-death experience, survived a tracheotomy, survived the entire apparatus of MGM's disapproval, survived the public hatred of an entire nation. Elizabeth Taylor, at 29, was in love in a way she had not been since Mike Todd. Maybe in a way she had never been, even then. This one was different. This one was equal. And equality, with Richard Burton, was a magnificent, violent, impossible thing. They could not be in the same room without the temperature changing. Everyone who knew them said it. Directors, crew members, fellow actors. When Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were in a scene together, the air itself seemed to rearrange. He had a voice, that voice, the most famous voice in the English language, a baritone that seemed to come from somewhere geological, and when he aimed it at her, she aimed something back. Not her voice, her eyes, those violet eyes that had been weaponized by MGM at age 9. He was the only man in the world who didn't blink. They married on March 15, 1964, in Montreal, Canada, a small ceremony, just the two of them and witnesses, while the world's press waited outside the hotel. Both had divorced their respective spouses. Both were free. Both were, in the deepest and most complicated sense, free for the first time in their adult lives. The Burton-Taylor years, the decade that followed their marriage, were the most visible, the most mythologized, the most talked about years of either of their lives. They made 11 films together. They traveled the world on chartered yachts and private planes. They fought with a ferocity that alarmed even the people who loved them. They reconciled with the same ferocity. They drank, both of them, heavily, daily, in the particular way of people who find the world too bright, too loud, too demanding, without chemical assistance. And Burton gave her diamonds. The Krupp diamond, 33.19 carats, bought at auction for $305,000 in 1968. The Taylor-Burton diamond, 69.42 carats, the most famous diamond in the world, purchased from Cartier at auction in October 1969 for $1.1 million. It was so large, so famous, that Cartier displayed it in their New York store for 2 days before delivery, charging admission, simply because people wanted to see it. When a reporter asked Elizabeth if she felt guilty owning something so extravagant while people in the world were starving, she said, "I know I'm lucky, but I didn't steal it." She wore it everywhere. She wore it because Burton gave it to her. She wore it because at 37 years old, she had lost a father to early death, a first husband to violence, a beloved husband to a mountain in New Mexico, and she knew, with the certainty that grief teaches, that the only permanent things are the ones you hold in your hand. But diamonds, even perfect ones, have fault lines. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? 1966 is the greatest film either of them ever made. It is the story of George and Martha, a middle-aged couple at a prestigious American university who savage each other over the course of a single night with a brutality that is barely controlled, barely fictional. Director Mike Nichols cast Elizabeth and Richard not because they were available, but because they were essentially playing themselves. Elizabeth gained 30 pounds for the role. She refused to wear her trademark eye makeup. She looked, deliberately, like a woman who had let herself go, which, in Hollywood terms, was an act of revolution. MGM executives were horrified. Nichols was delighted. She won her second Academy Award. When she accepted it on April 10, 1967, Richard Burton was in the audience. He had also been nominated for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. He did not win. The camera found his face in the audience when her name was announced. He was clapping, and he was smiling, and his smile contained everything: pride, love, something that looked very much like pain. They were the most famous couple in the world. They were also in private, losing each other. The drinking accelerated. The fights became longer, louder, less easily repaired. Burton's stage career pulled him toward London. Elizabeth's film commitments pulled her to Los Angeles, Rome, wherever the next production was. The separations grew longer. The reconciliations grew shorter. On June 26, 1974, after 10 years of marriage, Elizabeth Taylor filed for divorce. She said, at the time, "We had to stop before we killed each other." 16 months later, on October 10, 1975, in Botswana, they remarried. The second marriage lasted 9 months. It was, everyone could see, an act of longing rather than judgment. The fire was still there. The connection was still there. But the thing that had made them work, that equal, ferocious, consuming intensity, was also the thing that made them impossible. On July 29, 1976, they divorced again, for good. Richard Burton never fully recovered from losing her. Elizabeth Taylor never fully recovered from losing him. Some diamonds, broken, cannot be reassembled into what they were. She was 44 years old, and she had been married 5 times. The world had watched every marriage, documented every divorce, offered opinions she had not requested and would not receive. The tabloids had a formula for Elizabeth Taylor by now, a template that could be run on deadline. New man, wedding, trouble, divorce. They waited for the next iteration with the patience of people who had learned, from experience, that it would come. It came in the form of John Warner. Senator John Warner of Virginia was a Republican politician, a former Secretary of the Navy, a tall, silver-haired, patrician man who met Elizabeth at a party in late 1976. He was recently divorced. She was recently, again, available. They were married on December 4, 1976. It was, by Elizabeth's own account in interviews, a marriage she entered for the wrong reasons. Not wrong in the way Nikki Hilton was wrong. No violence, no cruelty. Wrong in the quieter, more insidious way. She was lonely. She was tired. She was a woman who had defined herself for 30 years through the intensity of romantic love, and she was trying to find that intensity in a man who was fundamentally, genuinely ordinary. John Warner was a good man. He was simply not Richard Burton. She moved to Virginia with him. She attended political events as a senator's wife. She smiled at fundraisers and stood in receiving lines and wore dresses that were appropriate and not too revealing. She gained weight, significantly, visibly, and the tabloids, who had spent years criticizing her for being too thin, now spent years criticizing her for not being thin enough. She said later that the marriage felt like slowly disappearing. She drank more during those years. The painkillers, originally prescribed for her spinal problems, which had been severe since childhood, became something she reached for, not just for pain but for feeling, or for the absence of feeling. She had trouble knowing, by then, which she wanted more. The divorce from Warner came in November of 1982, quiet, mutual, civilized. And then, in December 1983, a limousine arrived at the entrance to the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California. Elizabeth Taylor stepped out. She was 51 years old. She was checking herself in. The decision was not easy. It was made possible, in part, by a man she barely knew at the time, a friend who had watched her at a party and quietly, carefully, without judgment, said, "I think you need some help." That man was Michael Jackson. It is easy to reduce the Taylor-Jackson friendship to its surface strangeness. The aging actress and the young pop star. A friendship that confused the press and amused the public. But those who knew them both said it was simpler and deeper than it appeared. They recognized each other. Two people who had been famous since childhood. Two people whose early lives had been managed, commodified, and consumed by institutions and families and industries that had decided their public value before they had any say in it. Elizabeth called Michael Jackson, in an interview, "the least weird person I've ever known." She meant it exactly as she said it. At Betty Ford, for the first time in years, Elizabeth Taylor was not a symbol. She was not an asset or a legend or a cautionary tale. She was simply a patient, a woman with an addiction and a body that hurt, and a life that had become, somewhere in the middle of all the glamour, genuinely unmanageable. She stayed, she did the work, and when she came out the other side, thinner, clearer, quieter, something had changed in her that went deeper than sobriety. She was ready, for the first time, to fight for someone other than herself. In September 1985, Rock Hudson died. He was 59 years old. He had been one of the biggest male stars of Hollywood's golden age. Tall, dark, impossibly handsome, the quintessential leading man of the 1950s. He had been Elizabeth Taylor's friend for 30 years. When he appeared at a press event in July of 1985, visibly ravaged, gaunt, pale, unrecognizable, the world suddenly understood what no studio publicist could manage away. Rock Hudson had AIDS. AIDS, in 1985, was not just a medical crisis. It was a catastrophe of stigma. The Reagan administration had barely spoken the word publicly. The religious right called it divine punishment. Hospitals in some states were reportedly refusing treatment to AIDS patients. Gay men were dying in their 20s and 30s, terrified and isolated, and large sections of official America preferred to look the other way. Elizabeth Taylor looked directly at it. She had known Rock Hudson's secret for years. She had watched the disease take him, quietly at first, then with horrible speed. When he died on October 2nd, 1985, at his home in Beverly Hills, she was not surprised. She was furious. Not at Hudson, not at the disease, at the silence. She had co-founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, earlier that year with scientist Dr. Mathilde Krim becoming the public face of an organization fighting for funding for research, for basic human dignity in the treatment of people dying from a disease that polite society had decided was someone else's problem. She testified before Congress. She phoned senators who did not return her calls and called them back until they did. She stood in fundraising galas in diamonds and evening gowns and made people who had come for the spectacle write the checks that funded the science. She raised, over the course of the next 2 decades, more than $100 million for AIDS research. She founded the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation in 1991. When critics, and there were critics, even in Hollywood, said she was too closely associating her name with a disease considered shameful, she said, "I will not be silent while friends die." She did not perform her activism. She lived it. This is the part of Elizabeth Taylor's story that tends to get buried under the marriages and the diamonds and the tabloid headlines. But it is, arguably, the most important part, because it represents something the MGM system had tried very hard to extinguish: a woman with her own values, acting on them, regardless of the cost to her image. The same woman who had been told, at 9 years old, what to look like and what to say and how to be. The same woman who had been weighed every week. The same woman who had been photographed at her wedding and at her husband's funerals and at her lowest and at her highest, and who had always been the object of someone else's story. She was telling her own story now, and it was not the one anyone had written for her. She also married again, her 7th marriage, to Larry Fortensky, a construction worker she had met at the Betty Ford Center in 1988. They married on October 6, 1991, at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch. He was 20 years younger than she was. The marriage was met with considerable public ridicule. Elizabeth did not appear to notice, or if she noticed, she did not care. She had spent 50 years caring what America thought of her. She was done. They divorced in 1996. It was, like the Warner marriage, without malice. He had been kind to her. Kindness, she had learned, was not nothing. It was not everything either, but it was not nothing. By the mid-1990s, the body that Hollywood had catalogued and controlled and coveted for 5 decades was beginning to tell its own story. The back injuries that had started in childhood, a scoliosis diagnosis when she was young, worsened by decades of physical productions, horseback riding, stunts, had become chronic. She walked with difficulty. She required a cane in her late 60s. Each surgery brought temporary relief and left behind new complications. In April 1997, she was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. It was operated on successfully. The press gathered at the hospital gates as they had always gathered, at her first marriage, at her tracheotomy, at Mike Todd's funeral, at Richard Burton's funeral in 1984. The cameras were always there. Even this could not be private. Richard Burton had died on August 5, 1984, at the age of 58, of a cerebral hemorrhage in Geneva, Switzerland. He was with his 4th wife, Sally Hay, when he died. Elizabeth Taylor was not at his bedside. She had not been his wife for 8 years, but she went to Geneva for the funeral, and she stood at the graveside in the August Swiss sun, and the photographs from that day, her face, which had been photographed 10,000 times, show something that no studio photographer had ever captured. She looked like herself, whatever that meant. After everything, the friendship with Michael Jackson continued through his own controversies, his legal battles, his years of public humiliation. She stood by him when others withdrew. He called her his best friend. She returned the word without hesitation. When he died on June 25, 2009, she did not release a statement immediately. She went quiet. The quietness lasted days. When she finally spoke, she said, "My heart is broken." She was 77 years old. Her heart had been broken many times. She had learned, somewhere along the way, that a broken heart does not end a life. It expands it, makes it larger, more complicated, more fully inhabited. By 2010, she was largely housebound. The congestive heart failure that had been diagnosed several years earlier was progressing. She spent time with her children and grandchildren. She gave occasional interviews, rare, warm, impeccably honest. She wore her jewelry, always the jewelry. There was a particular piece she was photographed in the last years, not the famous Taylor Burton diamond, which had been sold in 1978 to fund a hospital in Botswana. She had asked Burton to use it for something good, and he had, not the Krupp diamond, something smaller, a simple gold bracelet that had belonged to Mike Todd. She wore it on her left wrist. She wore it until the end. The last months were quiet. There were no film productions, no galas, no press conferences, no diamonds around the throat, above the scar that had been there since 1961. The tracheotomy scar that had never let her forget, even in the best years, that she had once been minutes from death. She had been minutes from death many times. She had always come back. On March 23, 2011, at 1:58 in the morning, Elizabeth Taylor died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. She was 79 years old. The cause was congestive heart failure. Her 4 children, Michael Wilding Jr., Christopher Wilding, Liza Todd, and Maria Burton Carson, were with her. The woman who had been alone for so many of the most important moments of her life, alone at Mike Todd's crash site, alone in the dark of the Dorchester Hotel when her lungs failed, alone in the particular way that fame makes you alone, even in a crowded room, was not alone at the end. She had arranged in her will that her funeral begin 15 minutes late. She always wanted to be fashionably late, her publicist said. She wanted to make one last entrance. She was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, next to the graves of family friends, not far from the grave of Michael Jackson. The tributes that came in the hours and days after her death were immediate, enormous, global. Presidents spoke. Directors and co-stars and fellow actors spoke. Fashion designers spoke. AIDS organizations released statements. The AMFAR board released a statement calling her the mother of the global AIDS movement. The Taylor Burton diamond, sold decades earlier, the proceeds used for a hospital, had in the end been what it was supposed to be, not a possession but a gift. Not a symbol of excess, but a symbol of purpose, repurposed. That was, in a way, Elizabeth Taylor's whole story. She had been given to the world as a symbol, a beautiful, brilliant, complicated symbol. And she had spent 79 years trying to be something more than what they made of her. Trying to be Liz, ordinary, messy, hungry, human, inside the extraordinary construction they called Elizabeth Taylor. She did not always succeed, but she never stopped trying. Diamonds are formed under pressure. That is the geological fact. Carbon atoms, subjected to temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius and pressures 45,000 times that of the surface of the Earth, rearrange themselves into something harder than almost anything else in nature. It takes time. It takes an almost unimaginable amount of force. But what comes out the other side is not just hard, it is clarified. It is capable, under the right light, of refracting the full spectrum of human experience into something visible, something you can hold in your hand. Elizabeth Taylor was born into the diamond era of Hollywood, the last age when studios manufactured legends, when a face could be a civilization's dream, when beauty was both a gift and a transaction. She was, from the beginning, treated as a stone to be shaped. But stones do not have a choice. She did. She chose, over and over again, to be more than what they made of her. More than a face, more than a marriage, more than a headline. She chose to stand in front of Congress and demand funding for people dying of a disease that powerful men preferred not to acknowledge. She chose to check herself into a rehabilitation clinic when the easier, safer, more image-conscious choice would have been to keep pretending. She chose 8 times to believe in love, a choice that required more courage, when you know the full history, than anything she ever did on a film set. Was she perfect? No. Was she always wise? No. Was she, underneath the violet eyes, and the diamonds, and the 8 marriages, and the magazine covers, and the court cases, and the Oscar speeches, and the scar on her throat, was she human? Completely, entirely, devastatingly human. That is what Hollywood forgot to account for. You can polish a diamond, you can appraise it, display it, sell it, photograph it under 100 different lights. But a diamond was once something else, something in the dark, under pressure, becoming Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor, born February 27, 1932, in Hampstead, London, was always becoming. She never stopped. If this story moved you, if it made you see her differently, see the era differently, see the cost of making legends, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every comment means more stories like this one get told, and stories like this one deserve to be told. Thank you for watching.